The Sophists have a historically bad reputation, not just in ancient Greece, but ever since the explosion of philosophy out of Greece in the West. So, in this lecture video, I'm going to focus on two Sophists, Protagoras and Gorgias. Protagoras is this legendary figure that when you see the dialogue Protagoras by Plato, he really seems to have an equal engagement with Socrates. Socrates really seems to have, in a sense, met his match in that it's not quite clear who the winner of the debate is in the Protagoras over the question of whether virtue is teachable or not. Now, I think, of course, that the point of the dialogues, Plato's dialogues, is not to be a kind of doctrine that tells you what the truth is, right? But it's meant for engagement from the reader. So perhaps, really, maybe there is, hopefully, Plato thinks a winner, or dialectically there can be a kind of synthesis, but that has to be brought out by the reader themselves. Protagoras is also mentioned actually in Plato's Theaetetus as well. Some people think perhaps he's strawmanned in that text. Perhaps there was a reason, again, in the similar way to why Heraclitus might have been strawmanned. It wasn't just to make Socrates look better or something like that. But nonetheless, Protagoras was this hugely influential figure, a kind of rock star legend. Everybody knew who he was. So Protagoras was from Abdera, which was what we would now say a part of modern Macedonia. Then we also have Gorgias. Gorgias is from Leontini, which now is known as the town of Lentini in Sicily, Italy. Gorgias also another famous figure that Plato named a dialogue after Gorgias as to whether there is truth in rhetoric. And we don't have any surviving texts, sadly, Protagoras, so what we have are kind of fragments of what people say about Protagoras or what Protagoras said. But we do actually have, from surviving fragments, what people say, but it seems close to actually what actually was written by Gorgias that we'll read later as to the power of rhetoric. So, coming from the dialogue Protagoras by Plato and this debate over whether virtue is teachable or not, Protagoras is kind of the teacher. He's the guy you want to go to. You want your son to go to learn from. In the Protagoras, it's said by Protagoras that, my boy, if you associate with me, trying to convince the follower of Protagoras, who's already a student of his, why he actually should still continue to want to learn from Protagoras. Protagoras says, my boy, if you associate with me, the result will be that the very day you begin, you will return home a better person. And the same will happen the next day too. Each day you will make constant progress toward being better. Protagoras teaches a man that good counsel concerning his personal affairs, so that he may best manage his own household, and also concerning the city's affairs, so that as far as the city's affairs go, he may be most powerful in acting and in speaking. And we have here, then we can see with the Sophists, this emphasis on education, a kind of philosophy of education, the kind of practical benefits of philosophy, an emphasis on virtue, not just the kind of very abstract cosmological thinking that we see in the other Presocratics. So it's interesting we have in the sense that, well, the power that Protagoras has, the wisdom, and I should mention that the Sophists, right, comes from the Greek word Sophia for wisdom, so literally they're the wise people. But the Sophists famously charge for their teachings, unlike the philosopher, who does not charge, or at least it's not all about money, making money for the philosophers, which is why Plato had, the Sophists, so many dialogues, either named after Sophists. We also have the Hippias Major and the Hippias Minor dialogues, but other characters that serve in his dialogues like Thrasymachus, for example, another sophist. The power of this idea of almost becoming kind of like a pop celebrity that tries to get as many people as possible to follow them. I think we can think of people perhaps like this maybe on YouTube. I'm thinking kind of like the Andrew Tate type people that have the key to solving your problems, and you'll learn so much from them, and you'll become like a real man, and so on, right? In a sense, that's kind of like what the sophists are doing. But I want to stress there is a kind of truth, perhaps, or at least we should take seriously that there is maybe truth. We need to investigate it as to what the sophists are arguing. Because why else would it be that Socrates seems to have kind of met his match in the dialogue, the Protagoras, or that, all the criticisms against imitation, and Plato in his dialogues as well is engaging in imitation. What is it about the power of imitation? Or even in the dialogue, Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus. It's about rhetoric, and yet at the end of the dialogue, as it's mentioned by Socrates, well, you can reread the dialogue and learn something new again. If words just said the same thing over and over again, then you wouldn't, once you read something the first time, you get exactly what is said by the author, and yet that's not what happens when we read. So what is it about the power of dialogue? And why is it that someone like Protagoras could be such an excellent teacher, that he can proclaim that he can, just from one day of lessons, improve someone's life? Now, it's not just through the power of rhetoric, according to Protagoras, that he can improve someone's life, make them a better person, perhaps a virtuous person. It's not by nature. So wisdom, according to Protagoras, is not born by nature. It's not something you're born with, or it's something innate that you kind of tap into, but it's a combination of nature and training, that one has to kind of have the potential, but that potential has to be realized through a teacher. So, as Protagoras is said to have said, art, the Greek word techne, so not meaning kind of like, a painting, but any kind of technology, a craft, something like that, that art without practice and practice without art are nothing. And education is not implanted in the soul unless one reaches a greater depth. Now, Protagoras, this famous teacher, he also has a couple sayings that seem to maybe make him into a relativist that we find from Sextus Empiricus, which is taken up in Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, the saying that a person is the measure of all things. Of things that are, they are. And of things that are not, that they are not. Now, this is typically taken to be a kind of relativism or subjectivism, right? That, well, the truth of a matter, it's really all about your perspective and how you view things. And to some extent, I think we can see some truth in it, in that, of course, we have certain perspectives that we rely on as human beings, as what it means to be a human being. The question is whether that really means there is truth beyond our perspective, or whether we can only know truth according to our own perspective. And of course, the criticism that comes along with that is, well, if it is the case that you can only ever know something from your own perspective, how can you know that then it's human beings, it's just perspectives that actually measure all things? Because it seems like it would have to be a kind of judgment that's beyond your own perspective, that you can see the totality of how a perspective works, the nature of perspective. We also have, of course, the emphasis of rhetoric over logic. So we have from Aristotle in his text, The Rhetoric, where he's talking about Protagoras' method, where he says, this is making the weaker argument stronger, and people were rightly annoyed at Protagoras' promise. This should sound familiar to anyone who's read Plato's Apology, where famously part of the criticism of Socrates, what gets him on trial, is this idea that he is kind of, Socrates is kind of a sophist, going around making the weaker argument stronger, making people who are actually smart look like idiots by twisting their words, by manipulating them. And this is why, Socrates wants to show, no, philosophy is not doing the same thing that sophists are doing. It doesn't entirely rely on rhetoric. Now, of course, it's not exactly the case that someone like Protagoras is just going to say, yeah, I'm just manipulating words, what I'm saying is bullshit. Protagoras is going to say, no, I'm actually telling you the truth, but there is a certain power in rhetoric. And if you want to become, for example, a successful politician, you need skills of oratory, because you need the ability to control and command a crowd. Now, there's this further question that comes out of this kind of a position by Protagoras, which is that Protagoras says, look, a speech, when mixed with the truth of the matter, is true. So you can't just kind of say anything, willy-nilly. You can't, just bullshit. It has to in some way connect with circumstances as they actually are. But there's this question that results, which is, when we're talking about skills of oratory, lawyers are known to be master manipulators of words. That's how they try to win court cases, persuade juries. There's this question that comes from Protagoras, and this emphasis on rhetoric. That, okay, Protagoras, if you say, look, for my speech to be true, it has to in some way be mixed with, relate in some way to how matters of fact actually are. But the problem is, how does a juror know the truth of the matter? And this is where we can see again the power of rhetoric. Well, the juror has to judge whether they think your speech is mixed with the truth of the matter. So it's up to you to try to use further words, further logos, to convince them that it actually does. So it's still, even then, whether truth of the matter corresponds to your speech, your statement of fact, that depends on a further articulation. It still depends on rhetoric. Now, turning to Gorgias, he's very interesting, I think, because, again, we get this kind of almost direct account of his actual writings. And we have this argument that he gives about Helen from the Trojan War. So, famously in the Trojan War, Helen is blamed for starting it because she basically gets persuaded to leave the person that she's supposed to be married to and goes over to Trojan in Ionia, now modern day Turkey, and then the Greek city-states kind of form an army to go over and take her back, and they destroy Troy and so on. So it's known in the ancient Greek world by everyone that Helen is to blame. She started this war because she left. She caused this conflict. But what Gorgias wants to do, though, is show actually the power of rhetoric and show, what? Every Greek knows it's Helen's fault. And yet Gorgias says, I'm going to use rhetoric to show you, to persuade you, that actually there's no reason to blame Helen at all. That he says, I'm going to show you how rhetoric can make the weaker the stronger. Can show how the one who is persuaded is not unjust. And that the one who is persuaded is wrongly blamed. The fault lies with the persuader. So he begins by saying that the power of logos is like a drug to the soul, in the way that certain drugs work to amplify certain effects in the body and how the mind or the soul reacts. In the same way, certain kinds of speech can affect the way we think, the way we desire things. And he gives an example of poetry. He says, poetry is just logos with a meter. He says, those who hear it are overcome with fearful shuddering, tearful pity, and mournful yearning, and over the good fortunes and ill farings of other people and their affairs, the soul experiences a feeling of its own through the words. That through poetry, we can begin to feel things that we wouldn't otherwise feel. It almost reading just a poem can overtake us with emotion. And that's the point, is out of nothing, right? We don't have to be in contact with something in the real world. We just read the words and we're overcome with emotion. Our whole demeanor can change. Similarly, Gorgias says, with inspired incantations, that this is logoi, so a combination of speeches or words that brings on pleasure and brings away grief. He says, for conversing with the soul's opinion, the power of incantation charms, persuades, and changes it by witchcraft. And of course, Gorgias says, well, what is meant by witchcraft is really just changing the errors of the soul and deceptions of opinion. That out of basically seemingly nothing, the ability to just speak to someone, you can do something like that. You can take their grief away. The trick of rhetoric for Gorgias lies in the fact that all who have persuaded or who persuade anyone of anything do so by fashioning false logos. For if on all subjects everyone had memory of the past, a conception of the present, and foreknowledge of the future, logos would not be similarly similar as it is for people who, as things are, cannot easily remember the past, consider the present, or divine the future. So he's saying, look, the way that rhetoric works is you try to figure out, what does someone not know? And you play into that. You play into that ignorance because you can manipulate them. Because not every human being has full knowledge of the past, present, and the future. And so whatever it is you're trying to get them to do, how you're trying to persuade them, you want to play into that aspect of their ignorance. Because that is where you can have an account of false truth. Now, this is really important because this contrasts with someone like Parmenides, who claims, well, there can be nothing that is not, right? You can't have a false being, in a sense. And the Sophists say, no, actually, that's how rhetoric works, is you have false truth. If you can have false truth, and if it works in this way that it preys on the ignorance of someone where they don't know better, that Gorgias says that's why you cannot blame someone for being persuaded by logos. So, actually, Helen is wrongly blamed for being persuaded to go to Troy and starting the whole war. The injustice occurred by the person who persuaded her, not in her action by being persuaded. We also have this short text on what is not, where Gorgias tries to again use rhetoric to show how he can prove the seemingly impossible argument that things don't exist. Right? So we get this basic understanding that everyone has that things exist, that this glass with water in it, and that I can drink it. Or just even, maybe if you don't know that's water or not, that just things, whether they're water or not, just things exist. Gorgias is going to show how using rhetoric he can prove to you, he can persuade you, might be the better way of phrasing it, that things don't exist. And we should also think of this maybe in light of Parmenides' argument that which exists cannot not be. So the argument that Gorgias lays out works like this. First, if the non-existent exists, so if that which is false or that which has no being exists, it will both exist and not exist at the same time. Now, secondly, existence does not exist since it is eternal or generated. If it is eternal, it has no beginning and is therefore nowhere. If it's nowhere, well, it can't exist. There's nowhere to find the eternal because it has no being, it has no generation, it hasn't ever come into existence. And if existence is generated, then it must have come from something. Well, what could it come from? The only thing that exists that makes possible existence, which is existence itself. And so here we have a circular argument which must be denied. Now, non-existence can't produce anything, so it doesn't have that problem. But existence, if it does exist, can neither be one nor many, which everyone has to say, well, if something exists, it has to be of many of a kind or one of a kind. If it is one, Gorgias says it would be divisible, and therefore it wouldn't be one. So it wouldn't be the kind of existence that Parmenides talks about, and it wouldn't be the kind of one that is just existence. There would be different kinds of existence, but not different kinds of things that exist, but different kinds of existence, which doesn't make any sense at all, because there would just be existence or non-existence. And if existence is many, it would be a composite of separate entities, right? And so no longer be the thing known as existence. Therefore, things do not exist. Now, if you're not persuaded, Gorgias continues. He says, look, The very concept of existence is incomprehensible. You can't even make sense of it. He says, therefore, it is not the case that what is thought of. Further, it is completely clear that things that are thought of are not things that are. For if things that are thought of are things that are, all things that are thought of are, indeed, however anyone thinks of them. But this is apparently false. For if someone thinks of a person flying or chariots racing in the sea, it is not the case that forthwith a person is flying or chariots in the sea. His point is that, look, we know that imagination doesn't depend on anything in the actual world for it to exist, right? I can think of a unicorn or something like that. If I want to think that existence is comprehensible, I can actually have an understanding of what existence is, of what it means to exist. The problem is the gap between the thinking, which is in logos and words, the understanding, and its matter of fact. And the problem is we know that thinking isn't necessarily connected to what is matter of a fact. So your account of existence, Gorgias is saying, doesn't depend on the actual world as it is at all. If that's the case, then you can't have an account of what existence actually is, because it's necessarily something external to the mind, or at least it depends on, not just mind-dependent things, but as well as mind-dependent, also mind-external. Now, assume, though, that existence can be comprehended. It also is the case that it can't be conveyed to another. You can't even speak and explain existence to another where someone else can understand it. He says, for if things that are visible and audible, and generally perceptible, and in fact are external objects, and of these, the visible are comprehended by vision, and the audible by hearing, and not vice versa, how can these be communicated to one another? For that by which we communicate is logos, but logos is not the objects, the things that are. Therefore, it is not the case that we communicate things that are to our neighbors, but logos, which is different from objects. So again, even if we can have an understanding of existence, we can't explain to someone else what existence is, because we can only explain it using logos, using words, and words are necessarily divorced from the world. They are signs, right? They're meant to be kind of signifiers for what is signified, what really is. This is a problem that's picked up by someone like Augustine later on in his text, The Teacher, where Augustine tries to show that actually signs can never really lead you to the signified. They can never really lead you to the thing that is. They only ever lead to more signs. This idea of the power of persuasion is something that, Plato takes very seriously. Can we ever get to the thing itself? Can we ever talk about truth? Or is it all just, you say, I say? It's all just words. This is something that Aristotle, after Plato, Aristotle famously establishes kind of what we understand in the Western world as logic now. The whole kind of, deductive method and so on. So I think the question that we're left with from the Sophists, I think these are powerful arguments. And we have to take seriously whether or not it is necessarily true that one should not be blamed for being persuaded of a falsehood. What are the kind of ethical implications of we have to admit the power of rhetoric, even if we're not sure about whether or not, it's true that, we can never really talk about logic and never really know the truth of a matter because it's all persuasion. Putting that to the side, just the ethics of rhetoric. Is it necessarily true that one should not be blamed, right? And no matter what, because of the power of rhetoric, as Gorgias was trying to argue, that one should never be blamed for being persuaded of a falsehood? Or are there circumstances where we think, even if we admit the power of rhetoric and the way that it prays, the way it works is it preys on ignorance, that we still shouldn't blame that person, or that we actually should blame that person, right? Maybe there are certain thresholds that are met in perhaps the things done that someone is persuaded to do that are worthy of being blamed.